Okay, so hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our workshop on understanding and supporting behaviour as part of our Childhood Neurodiversity Parent Workshop programme. My name is Dr. Lucy Hunn, and I am a clinical psychologist, and I work within the Psychology in Schools team, which sits in the early intervention part of children and adolescent mental health within NSFT in Suffolk. And today I have with me...
Hi everyone, I'm Anna and I'm a trainee clinical psychologist in the team with Lucy.
Thanks, Anna. Okay, so I'd also like to thank Suffolk Parent Carer Forum Network for their contributions and input into kind of reviewing our materials for today. I'd just like to say that from feedback that we've had from parents within this programme, everybody's felt like there's a lot of information that we go through, so we have introduced a little break halfway through. It's just going to be 3 minutes, so it's not a really long break because I think we felt like we didn't want to have to cram the content. But just to let you know that that will be coming halfway through. But what we'd absolutely encourage you to do is throughout the workshop, move around. We can't see you, so kind of make sure you're moving and doing whatever you need to be able to engage with it the best you can. If that means that you miss a little bit, you will be sent the recordings from the workshop and the slides in a few days' time. So you will have that to look back on. So please don't feel that you have to be kind of glued to the screen for the whole thing, but do what you need to be able to kind of make the most of this learning opportunity. If I can get my slides to move with me. Are they moving for you, Anna?
No.
There we go. Okay. So a bit of an overview of what we're doing today. So the first half of the workshop, I'm going to be talking, and that's kind of mainly on thinking about understanding behaviour. So thinking about behaviour as communication and thinking about how responses from other people and what impact that has on young people's behaviour. And then Anna's going to be thinking about how we can support behaviour. So thinking about strategies that we might be able to use, thinking about connecting with our young people, thinking about the role of kind of recognition, supporting autonomy and kind of those natural reinforcers, thinking a bit about how we can work with schools when thinking about supporting behaviour, and then finishing with thinking about looking after ourselves. So just for anybody kind of attending today who's seen the previous workshop, the Introduction to Neurodiversity one, right at the beginning of this programme about a year ago, I guess we continue to reflect on how language around neurodiversity is really a personal choice. We'll be using language today that we think fits well and that we've had feedback on from parents and carers and from young people, but we just want to recognise that kind of everyone's language choices might be different, and so that we hope that the language used today is kind of thoughtful, and that the feedback that we've received from other families will be reflected in the slides you see today. And I will talk a little bit more about language when we kind of get into the content. But I just wanted to, before we start the topic, just highlight that we might not be able to please everybody with the language that we use today, but hopefully you can see that we've been thoughtful about that language when thinking about how we describe what's going on with behaviour. I also just want to acknowledge that this is a really big topic. Today is definitely just a little introduction, as kind of a snapshot into how we might be able to understand and support behaviour. But I would just encourage you to kind of seek support if you feel like you need it after this. And there's lots of resources at the end that we signpost to that have got lots of great things out there that can really support you and your family. So I would definitely recommend that you have a look through those resources that are flagged in the end slides. And you, as I say, you don't need to write them all down today. You will get sent the slides, so you will get a chance to kind of go through them, and there should be links that you can click on kind of at your own time. So, okay. So starting off with another Slido question. So what kind of behaviours are you concerned or worried about for your child or children? So kind of when you were thinking of attending this workshop today, kind of what behaviours was it that kind of popped to mind in terms of behaviours that you might need to think about when kind of supporting your young person? Okay, so look, that first person sounds like behaviours of distress. So kind of those shouting, crying, perhaps hitting their heads, frustrated behaviours that we see when young people are feeling frustrated or angry. Some of those kind of defiant behaviours. Oh, they're moving so quickly. Behaviours after school, where perhaps lots is built up during the school day and those behaviours might come out at night. Impulsive behaviours, kind of negative self-talk, some kind of violent behaviours. Those behaviours we see when emotions are dysregulated, So I think they move really quickly. So apologies if I didn't kind of name yours, but a lot of them came out as kind of behaviours related to emotions. So that anxiety, anger, frustration, sadness there, but also some of those behaviours like impulsivity or hyperactivity, lack of being aware of kind of strangers and dangers attached to that. A few people have kind of put the word meltdown, so thinking about again that kind of like overwhelming emotion, the behaviours we see with that, and I think a few people said swearing as well. That sense of being kind of their behaviours not being kind of within their control. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so then just stopping for a moment to think about, so we've kind of named all of those behaviours that it maybe feels quite difficult to support, but kind of how does that make you feel? Powerless. Yeah. A really strong word, isn't it, that word? Frustrated ourselves. Yeah, frustrated, upset, overwhelmed and frustrated, lost, tired, sad, frustrated, like we're letting our children down, guilty, worried, not knowing what to say. You're left with absolutely a lack of patience. Feeling like we're failing, hopeless, disappointed, sometimes angry that I can't help, frustrated, sadness, sad that they are struggling so much. There's some real themes there, isn't there? I think there's a lot of sadness, a lot of frustration at not being able to support the young person, but also just frustration at those behaviours. A sense of a lot of kind of being worried about doing the right thing or not having the right support. Feeling quite fearful, feeling like we can't fully support them, and feeling absolutely exhausted has come up a lot, hasn't it? So hopefully you can see from the Slido that there's lots of other parents feeling similar to how you're feeling, because it feels like there's real themes there running through how this makes us feel. Okay, worry. So other people have put worried, but there's also that kind of worry about their future lives and what they. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you for your honesty and for sharing how it makes you feel. So I guess it might seem like a bit of a. We've just talked about the kind of behaviours that you've kind of got in mind. So it might seem a bit of a silly question for me to say kind of what behaviours are we thinking about today? But I guess we felt that it's important just to name at the start that we're thinking about those behaviours that are causing difficulties for your young person and for yourself. So these might be behaviours that are kind of causing significant distress or perhaps creating safety concerns. So I think quite a few of you kind of talked to those safety concerns and that distress that your young person feels, but also that you're feeling yourself. So the aim of today is absolutely not to try and kind of change or criticize any behaviors that are kind of related to your young person's neurodivergence. And we want to kind of protect some of those things as well. So we will talk about that in a bit. But I guess we just wanted to give some context to kind of thinking about supporting behavior. So the term challenging behavior was originally intended to be used as a kind of diagnosis to stop people from feeling like they needed to fix a person. So originally that kind of term had quite positive connotations. It was about trying to concentrate on fixing the environment rather than the individual. But what we kind of know and what we absolutely recognize as a team, that actually this term has since been misused quite a lot, and actually it can be quite an emotive term for quite a few people. And that generally now kind of the preferred language is behaviours that challenge rather than challenging behaviour, because it puts that challenge sitting in kind of the other person or the other people experiencing those behaviours rather than the person themselves displaying those behaviours. More recently, kind of the term kind of behaviours of distress has been used quite a lot to highlight that behaviour is often that kind of a form of communication. But we just also want to highlight that it's not always about distress. So we kind of sought feedback from parents and carers who've previously attended their workshops and our workshop, sorry. And behaviours of distress was voted as the kind of preferred term, but we just wanted to acknowledge that it's not always distress that's underlying some of these behaviours. And so we just want to kind of caveat that. So when kind of approaching this topic, that kind of gives some context to the language we'll be using. But if you're kind of explaining it to other people or in conversations, you just use whichever language feels most comfortable for you. I guess we just want to kind of, I've said this before, but we just want to recognise that we're not trying to kind of change behaviours related to neurodivergence, which are not threatening kind of quality of life or physical safety of any of those kind of things. So as we've said throughout this kind of whole workshop programme, hopefully it's come across that actually we really want to be celebrating and supporting the unique differences of neurodivergent children. So we don't want to change neurodivergent children to fit neurotypical kind of cultural standards, but we want to celebrate their unique differences and strengths. So I guess like an example of this when we think about kind of behaviour is, for example, kind of an autistic child that might stim with kind of repetitive hand flapping. For some people that might be seen as unusual, but it serves a purpose for that young person. It helps them regulate, it helps them express themselves. So we absolutely wouldn't want to be changing that stimming behaviour if it's not impacting kind of safety and things like that. We don't want to try and fit that autistic person into neurotypical standards. And similarly, if we're kind of thinking about hyperactive children, we're not suggesting that a child that struggles with hyperactivity should sit still for long periods of time. In fact, we want to kind of be thinking about how we can change the environment to make it more neuroaffirmative so that they can be more comfortable, allowing kind of movement breaks, allowing kind of shorter chunks of learning and things like that. So we just wanted to use those things as a bit of an example of things that we're not concentrating on today, because actually we want to recognise that those kind of behaviours are really important for many of our young children. So we've just got a bit of a Slido to touch on that. So which unique behaviours do you love or really value about your neurodivergent child? So before we were thinking about the behaviours that are maybe feel like you need some kind of extra support to kind of manage, but what are the behaviours that actually, when you think about your child, you're like, oh, that is such a great strength. They always tell the truth. Yeah. They're musical. Yeah. Really good into their music. They're really confident. Yeah. Lovely. Their intelligence. They're artistic, creative and funny. They've got an amazing memory. They're really socially very confident. Oh, I love it. There's so many coming up. It's amazing. The excitement. Yeah, you can, when they flap their arms, like sometimes it's so lovely to see that real visible excitement that often we can kind of dampen down. But yeah, it's lovely to see that. Memory. So the ones that are getting bigger are the ones that are coming up more. So stuff around their kind of amazing memory and their creativity has obviously been talked about by lots of different people. Just trying to touch on some of those other ones. There's quite a few around empathy and affection. Enthusiasm, their kindness, their expressiveness, their generosity. Yeah, so many. His ability to notice details and changes. Yeah, so many wonderful, I was going to say characteristics, but this encompasses lots of different things, doesn't it? So many wonderful strengths that we can absolutely celebrate. So I just want to hold that in mind when we're thinking about some of the more difficult things today. Oh, we did have another Slido there that was about what behaviours would you want to protect for your young person. So you're not going to be able to respond to that one because it's not, for some reason, it's not logged into the Slido properly. But again, I just wanted you to take a moment to think about that. Like, what behaviours do our young people do that actually we really want to protect and nourish, because that's a part of them. Yeah, so just nice to kind of take a moment to think about that before we kind of go into the rest of our workshop. So here, this is the iceberg model. So this is likely something that you might have seen before, or it might be completely new to you. So this is the idea that what we see from a child's behaviour in front of us is just a small part of the story. It's kind of widely accepted that behaviours of distress are associated with communication difficulties. So that our young people kind of are struggling to communicate what's going on for them. And so what we see on the outside is often just a reflection of what's going on in the inside and not being able to necessarily communicate all of that. So kind of this model suggests that under the surface, there's actually a lot more going on that we may perhaps don't understand or hasn't come to light. So that's communication difficulties in general, but then thinking about kind of neurodivergent children who actually might really struggle with communication, social communication, or their emotional literacy, or with kind of language, it's often the case that we may only see those kind of signals of distress on the surface level. So we might just see those things at the top of the picture. So the Slido kind of touched on this. So some of that, we've got some quite different things. But so what we might see from the Slido would be that kind of that anger that we might see, or other people talked about some head banging. So that could kind of come into that self-harm that we might see. Or other people talked to that kind of lack of stranger awareness and things like that. So all of those different behaviours that we might see would be that bit at the top, kind of the top of the iceberg that we see. But then what might be underneath it is a whole lot of other stuff going on. So perhaps it could be stuff like this. So it might actually be that young person's feeling confused, or perhaps they're feeling some shame. So kind of what's coming out looks quite different, but underneath it, they might be feeling kind of embarrassed or shameful. Perhaps they're seeking some safety. Perhaps they're kind of pushing boundaries to try and understand where those boundaries are. Perhaps something's changed in the routine and that feels really unsettling. So we see what's at that top. Or perhaps they're feeling really angry at something, and it might not be angry at something in that moment. It might be that the anger is built up throughout the day. We often see that young people that mask, those feelings kind of build up throughout the day, and then at home, when they get home and they feel safer, lots of those, and it's just got to a kind of reached its peak, all of those behaviours come out. So often it might be something that's happened earlier in the day or earlier in the week that kind of is impacting on those behaviours we're seeing. Also got thinking about kind of basic needs. So it might be that they're hungry or thirsty or tired. So we're much more likely to be susceptible to kind of big emotions and being unable to kind of manage those kind of manage our behavior if our basic needs aren't being met. And that might just be because we're not cueing into the fact that we're hungry, or not cueing into the fact that we're thirsty. So when children kind of struggle to identify and communicate their emotions, it makes it really difficult for us to work out what's underneath the surface. So it makes it really difficult for us to understand those behaviours. And it can also make it really difficult to kind of work out what the triggers are so that we can kind of prevent those kind of behaviours in the future. And it might be really difficult for you to recognise this when your young person can't recognise it themselves either. So we're just going to think about the brain house. So if you've attended any of our previous workshops, you may well have heard the brain house already. It's a great accessible model by Dan Siegel, a kind of American psychiatrist. We really like this model because we think it's easy to kind of get your head around and to understand. And in this situation, when thinking about those kind of big emotions and the behaviours that we might see as a result of them, it's quite a helpful way for us to kind of explain it. So kind of our understanding of the brain is that using this model is that we've kind of got an upstairs part of our brain, and that's our control tower. So that's our prefrontal cortex, which deals with all of our executive functioning skills. So that's things like planning, rationalizing, kind of planning, rationalizing, logic, all of those kind of wonderful skills that allow us to do reasoning, allow us to do high level thinking, and regulate and engage with our emotions and have a sense of control. And our downstairs brain is more like our emotion center. So that's kind of our alarm system. It's where the amygdala and the limbic system sit, which are our emotion center. And that part of our brain, the main responsibility of that part of our brain is to keep us safe from danger. So that's why we often see kind of the fight, flight, or freeze response in our bodies. That's because that part of the brain has been activated and that needs to keep us safe. So either we kind of fight, flight, or freeze. And And this is because the amygdala detects a danger and it triggers that system and motivates us into action to keep us safe. So we need that part of our brain, that the emotion part, the downstairs part of our brain is so important. But we'll move on to thinking about what might happen if those two parts of the brain are not connected. So if the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain aren't connected. So Dan Siegel talks about flipping your lid. And I'm aware that this is a term that doesn't necessarily feel comfortable for everyone, but we're using it today because it's the language that Dr. Siegel uses. And it's essentially that when our emotions take over, when that emotion part of the brain is in control, we lose the skills from that top control tower part of our brain. So that control tower becomes offline, and that stairs it gets from the kind of downstairs emotion center isn't working to get us up to that executive functioning, planning, rationalizing part of our brain. So when we're calm and relaxed, we're able to feel emotions and make good decisions. So we're able to feel that emotion, but still use the other skills that are in our brain. But when those big feelings like anxiety, anger, frustration, when those overwhelming feelings take charge, something really significant happens in our brains, both for us and for our young people. And what happens is that downstairs part of the brain starts to take control, and temporarily our kind of top part, our executive functioning, our upstairs brain comes offline. And that's going to help us problem solve, rationalize, all of those things. So this is a real challenge, and we call it kind of flipping the lid, because you can no longer access that kind of prefrontal cortex. You can no longer access those skills that we really need to help us make good decisions. So we're purely being driven by that emotion part of our brain at the bottom. So what this can kind of look like for our young people is often they can feel completely overwhelmed by those big emotions. Something can happen and they can be completely in that emotional part of their brain, and they don't have access to kind of making good decisions, to using those other skills. And what we often try and do is in the moment, rationalize, settle them down, try and help them kind of problem solve in the moment. But actually that part of their brain isn't online. They are just being driven by that emotional part of their brain. So they're not going to be able to think logically and clearly. And we're going to have to wait till they get their upstairs brain back online to be able to do some of that kind of problem solving, rationalizing, kind of logical thinking. So we're going to think in a bit more detail later about kind of how we can get that upstairs part of the brain back online. And it's just important to recognize here that we will all kind of have this, we will all flip our lids, but our executive functioning part of our brain, so that upstairs control tower, actually isn't fully developed until our mid-20s. So we will all do this as adults, but it's going to be even harder for our young people, for our under 25s, to be able to access that top part of their brain when they're in that big emotion phase. Okay, so the brain house model isn't a model specific to kind of neurodivergent children or people, but here we just think about a few things that might make the brain house more kind of, I guess, make this model why young people might flip their lids more easily for neurodivergent children and teenagers, and why it might be harder for them to bring their kind of upstairs brain back online. So there's quite a few different factors that might make this more difficult. So they might be more sensitive to kind of sensory stimuli. So it might be that noise that's kind of activating that alarm system part of their brain continues to keep going, or they move from one environment where the noise feels overwhelming and is overstimulating to another environment where they're still having kind of that overstimulating noise. So there's lots of different sensory factors that will impact kind of that brain house model. There's also impulsivity. So things like reacting straight away in the moment, or wanting to do this and not necessarily being able to do that. So impulsivity might mean that brain house is activated more quickly. We've talked about how actually neurodiverse children might find it difficult to kind of regulate their emotions or even understand those big emotions. I'm kind of combining a couple there. But so to be able to kind of get our online brain upstairs brain back online, we need to be able to understand what those big feelings are and to be able to kind of regulate those big feelings. And that might be more difficult for somebody with neurodiversity, that's neurodivergent. They might have more frequent negative experiences. We know that things like bullying can often come up for young people. We know that sometimes lessons can be really difficult. So they just might be having more experiences that feel difficult. And that building up might mean that they are more likely to have that kind of upstairs brain go offline, because they're more likely to have experiences that are going to put them in that emotion driven behavior. And then thinking about executive, they may have executive functioning differences anyway. So it might be that some of those skills that sit in that upstairs control tower part of the brain, so the kind of executive functioning skills like planning, organizing, some of those skills might be impacted on already. So they're going to be even more vulnerable. Those skills are going to be even more vulnerable to going offline when that emotion part of the brain takes over. And then we're going to talk about the shame shield in a bit more detail now. Okay, so the shield of shame is a concept by Kim Golding and Dan Hughes. And we're kind of talking about it here in relation to the brain house model, and how actually when shame is activated, it might make us more likely to kind of flip our lid, or for that upstairs brain to go offline. And we just want to talk about it a bit more, given the response to this, kind of what this might create, what that might mean for kind of systems and the people around a young person. So feeling guilty for something is a feeling kind of regret for doing something that was considered bad or kind of wrong by others. Where shame, on the other hand, is much deeper. It's a really intense feeling. It's an awful feeling that that kind of sits with the person themselves, rather than feeling like it's the behavior that was wrong. Often shame is experienced as shameful for who I am, and that me as a person is bad or wrong or hated. And shame is such a difficult feeling. It's difficult for children, it's difficult for adults. And Kim Golding and Dan Hughes have talked about the shield of shame to think about how others respond, and can end up kind of pushing people away at a time when actually what they really, really need is connection. So that feeling of shame can often lead to people kind of denying a behavior. It might lead to somebody kind of minimizing a behavior. It might lead to somebody kind of pointing the finger and blaming someone else. It might lead to that rage, that anger that we often see, or it might lead to kind of freezing behaviors. And it's just the idea that when we feel shame, it's such a horrible emotion to feel, that we might do one of these things as kind of putting up a bit of a shield to feeling that shame. We don't want to have that feeling of shame ourselves, so we kind of put up our shield of shame, and that might come out in one of these kind of ways that you can see on the slide. So we just kind of wanted to highlight that, because actually that's a helpful way for us understanding what's going on underneath some of those behaviors sometimes. And so what the kind of the main thing with this is about connecting, and there's some restorative kind of scripts that can be used in this in the moments to be able to recover from those behaviors without shame. So it might be thinking about trying to move away from kind of our responses leading to any shame, but thinking about kind of what does your young person need in that moment, kind of what does their body need right now, and just letting them know that they've got unconditional love amongst all of those behaviors that they're displaying, that there is unconditional love there. And we'll talk more about connection before correction in the second half, when we think about kind of the importance of connecting with our young people. So we just want to think a little bit about responses to behavior, and I guess this links to that kind of perhaps what can sometimes create shame for our young people. But it's just thinking about when other people's kind of lack of understanding and means that the way that they respond to behavior can actually kind of escalate a situation. So an example might be kind of if a young person was just kind of throw themselves on the floor and refuse to move when they're experiencing kind of sensory overload, someone might kind of try and physically pick them up but that actually might make them feel more overwhelmed, and it might make them feel more uncomfortable, and that might actually make them kind of lash out, potentially injuring somebody that's trying to help, but actually that help was done without the understanding of what's going on for that young person. So without that understanding, their actions which they intended for help have actually further escalated the situation rather than helping the child to become regulated again. And then the other thing that can happen is kind of negative attention. So negative attention can actually sometimes increase the likelihood that a child will display behaviours that might be difficult for the adults around them or even unsafe. So an example of this might be that a neurodivergent child behaves in a way that's unsafe. So that could be kind of climbing much too high in a tree, or it might be hurting themselves. And the reaction from their peers around them could actually inadvertently encourage them to even escalate those behaviours. So if their peers started kind of laughing about their behaviour, or the neurodivergent child might kind of misinterpret this as, oh, actually they're finding this funny, and oh, I'm entertaining somebody, rather than understanding that they're being laughed at themselves. They might kind of misinterpret other people's response, and that negative attention might actually inadvertently reinforce some of what's going on. And we know that our neurodivergent young people can sometimes be more vulnerable to kind of peer pressure, encouraging them into kind of dangerous behaviours or behaviours that might be kind of difficult for the adults around them. This might be because the young person just wants to fit in or feel accepted. And we just wanted to acknowledge that that's something that can be at play with some of these behaviours. So kind of when a child is displaying a behaviour that's associated with their neurodivergence and not harmful or risky, being criticised or even punished for this can have a really detrimental impact on the child. So we talked before about how we don't want to get rid of the behaviours that our children do that are kind of unique and special to them as neurodivergent when those behaviours aren't kind of upsetting or distressing or causing harm. So what we don't want is for other people to be responding to behaviours in a way that feels punishing or criticising when our young people are displaying those behaviours. They may well be trying to kind of communicate something through that behaviour, communicating a need which isn't being met, or perhaps just being themselves. And we don't want them to kind of be subject to that repeated criticism or punishment that they might then start to kind of have a negative narrative about themselves, about being kind of wrong or bad. And that's something that we kind of want to be addressing if that is the case. And as we kind of touched on before, that feeling of shame, that can be so intense. And we've talked about the shield of shame and what a young person might do as a response to try and stop that feeling of shame. And I guess we just want to be mindful of kind of how others respond to our child, that they're not putting them into that place of shame where they're then going to be more likely to display some of those behaviours because they're feeling shameful and they want to kind of, they're using those behaviours as a shield to stop them feeling that really intense and difficult emotion. Okay, we're going to show a little video here. Enough of me talking, and we're nearly heading into kind of the strategies part. But this is from a snapshot from a TED talk by Dr. Stuart Olban. And he just tries to reframe some thinking from kids do well if they can. So I'll let him do the talking and then I will share a little bit.
That flies in the face of conventional wisdom can be summed up in a pretty simple phrase. And this is it. Kids do well if they can, which has become the guiding philosophy of our work, the foundation of our work. And when you look at it up here, you probably say to yourself, what's so earth-shattering about that? And on its own, it may not seem particularly earth-shattering, but it actually is, and I want to explain why. See, what kids do well if they can suggests is that if a kid could do well, he would do well. If she could do well, she would do well. And if she's not doing well, something must be standing in her way. And if something's standing in her way, then we all, as the helpers in her life, we need to figure out what's standing in her way so we can help. And I'm sure that sounds like perfect common sense to everybody, because it is. And yet, it flies in the face of conventional wisdom, because the more conventional way of thinking when it comes to challenging behavior is not kids do well if they can. It sounds a lot more like kids do well if they want to. And you see, if you believe kids do well if they want to and a kid's not doing well, so for instance, they're not behaving well, you believe kids do well if they want to, they're not behaving well, then you're going to assume the reason he's not behaving well is because he doesn't want to. And if he doesn't want to, then what's all of our jobs? To try to make him want to do well. And while that probably seems like a very narrow, unpleasant, probably pretty ineffective role to play in the lives of these kids, the interesting thing about it is when you think about traditional discipline in our homes, traditional school discipline, discipline in society, it is all oriented around trying to make kids want to do well. Rewards, punishments, timeouts, detention, suspensions, expulsions, you name it, they are all aimed at trying to motivate people to do better, safe in the assumption that they're not doing well because they don't want to. Well, you know what? I don't buy it. What I've learned is it doesn't make any sense. What I've learned is kids do well if they can. I believe kids do well if they can. I believe if a kid could do well, he would do well. And if he's not doing well, you know what? Something has got to be standing in his way. And it cannot be as simple as he just doesn't want to.
Okay. I'm going to try and get back to my slides.
Stock your lab.
Shall we go back into them?
Source your research.
Okay, it's not quite time for the break. I just want to have a moment to reflect on that video, but I can't show the slide without it showing the video. So I think we just really wanted to kind of take a moment to reflect on kind of what Dr. Stuart Alban talks about there in his TED Talk around kids will do well if they can. And actually, what is it that's getting in the way of them doing well? And I guess that goes with the notion of these behaviours that we're talking about today are often a way of a young person communicating with us that are communicating a need or communicating some distress or communicating something that's getting in the way of them doing well. So that's kind of the thought that we're going to leave you with. We're going to give you a 3-minute break. I know that doesn't feel very long, but hopefully it's enough to kind of get to the bathroom, get a drink, get whatever you need to get back. And hopefully just gives you a moment to pause to kind of take in what you've learned so far and then go into thinking about the strategies with Anna.
I think we're dead on 48 there, Lucy. Happy for me to start? Brilliant. Yeah. So hopefully you've all been able to do whatever you need to do in those couple of minutes just to feel ready to take in the second half, where we're going to think about some of those ways to support with those behaviours. So just as a bit of an overview, so we've spoken lots about understanding what's going on underneath the behaviour. So we're going to think about, once we have that understanding, what we can do to support. And linked in with that, we're going to talk about this idea of matching up whatever support we put in place, really matching with the underlying need of that behaviour. We're going to touch on connection before correction, which we've mentioned a few times. So we're going to actually explain what we mean by that. And we're going to think about recognition, autonomy, and natural reinforcements. I'll explain a bit more about what we mean by that. But then we've also got a few slides just to think about working with schools, because we know that's a big part of your young people's lives. And also just a quick nod to looking after yourself. So before we go on to get stuck into those, we're going to pop back onto Slido just to have a think about what do you find helpful in supporting behaviour, because we're going to go on to talk about ways to support that we know are reported as helpful and are supported by evidence. But this is a really helpful space, as we've already seen today, to kind of share your own experiences, because we know that is equally as helpful to one another. So mindfulness, breathing exercises, sometimes, yeah, absolutely. Keeping calm, breathing techniques, talking to people who understand, definitely. You can see that's coming up for a few people there. That's really lovely. So when dysregulated, asking what would you like to happen now? Yeah, absolutely. Really trying to get to the bottom of what they need. Yep, staying with her when she's upset and listening 100%. And I think that's what we're going to go on to think about, actually, the impact of just being there with someone. Good communication between home and school settings, absolutely. And that's, kind of highlighting why we're going to go on to talk about schools. Ensuring other children understand, absolutely. So really having sort of support from all ends there. Lovely. Thank you, everybody. There's some really nice examples there. Okay. So I suppose before we go on to talk about other ways to support that might feel a bit more practical, it does feel really important to start with this overarching message of connection before correction that we keep referencing, but we haven't actually fully explained. And this really ties into what some of you were just saying on that Slido. So we know, going back to the brain house, that when young people are totally overwhelmed, they don't have access to that top part of their brain. They're really in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. And that downstairs brain has taken control, and we know they're going to be very unlikely to be able to think rationally. And when a young person's sort of feeling that way in that state, our main aim really needs to be to help them calm down and feel safe again, so that we can get that upstairs thinking brain to come back online. And we know that actually the way that we can do that is by being with them in a warm, reassuring way. Physical connection, if possible, has a really helpful impact on reducing that stress response. It helps calm down that anxiety and starts to get that upstairs brain back online. So I guess we're referencing this now because we're going to talk about lots of strategies, but as you've all just kind of pointing out, actually in that moment when that upstairs brain is offline, what's really helpful is to always start with connection before correction. And we know that actually feeling calm is contagious. So if your child is struggling to access that thinking part of the brain, we can almost loan our upstairs part of our brain. So by being calm and coming alongside them to reassure them and help regulate them back to where they need to be. It is really important, though, I think, just to recognise here that actually this can be really hard. If your young person is really dysregulated, it can be really alarming, really upsetting for you, quite difficult. But I guess holding that in mind, the more calm that you can try and remain and try and connect with your young person in that moment, the more opportunity you're sort of giving them to develop those skills themselves. So we just thought it was important just to reference that idea of coming alongside and going for connection before correction. So really connecting with your young person, helping get that upstairs part of their brain back online before we go in and start rationalising and making plans of how to help support them with behaviours of distress. Okay. So we have spoken a lot today about this idea of understanding what's going on below that behaviour as being really key. So we really need to understand what is driving the behaviour, which might be difficult for your young person or for you around them. And we're really, within that idea, we're going back to that iceberg model idea. So what's going on below the surface? So not just what we're seeing, but actually what is happening for that behaviour to come to the surface. So we might be thinking, what is our young person trying to communicate through that behaviour to help us think about actually what's going on underneath that? But I think also just keeping in mind throughout that we do really need to hold in mind that earlier question of whether or not the behaviour itself is something that we should be concerned about or trying to change, or is it actually maybe that we need to educate others about this particular behaviour to understand and accept it rather than expecting the young person to change. So that's just going to be really personal to you knowing your young person, but I think it's just important for us to keep pushing that message of, is this a behaviour of distress that actually needs to sort of be thought about and we need to think about how can we support with that? Or is it actually that it's a behaviour that we really want to celebrate and the issue is that we need to educate people around them on that behaviour? So when we're saying about how can I understand that behaviour, if you're struggling to understand what the purpose of the behaviour is, we've spoken lots today about how difficult it can be. We're going to talk about some ways to try and understand that. So we've got on here a chart, which is an ABC chart. And essentially what this is it helps you track when and in what situations a behaviour is happening. So this chart specifically talks about and includes an antecedent, which is just talking about what's happening right before that behaviour is coming to the surface. It has a section about what the behaviour actually is in itself. So what is actually happening? What does it look like? And then thinking about who's involved and what are the consequences of that behaviour. And I guess what we mean by that isn't the typical form of consequences, something bad happens after you do this behaviour. It's more just what is happening as a result of that behaviour, what happens right after, or maybe a little bit in the future after that behaviour. So I guess this is just an example of actually starting to track the patterns of when this behaviour is happening, what's going on around this behaviour can really start to help us to maybe understand what is going on for that child to show this behaviour. So an ABC chart is one way of doing that. Another way of doing that is a star chart, which is really similar to an ABC chart, but we just tend to find the headings are maybe a bit easier to understand. So it's mapping again when the behaviour happened, the situation, content, whatever has triggered it, the action. So again, the behaviour itself described in detail, that so that we can be really clear on that, and the response. So again, what happened after, how did people respond is really helpful. And what we would say is, depending on how frequently you're seeing that behaviour of distress, we'd recommend tracking the behaviour with something like an ABC chart or a star chart for at least a couple of weeks, because then you have lots of examples written down, and it's helpful to kind of see lots of different examples to start thinking about patterns. And holding in mind that it's really helpful that if the behaviour is also happening at school, for school staff to take a responsibility of also completing these charts, because actually we know that school's a big part. These behaviours are likely to be happening there, and we really need school staff on board with doing that. And then what can happen is that a time can be planned to come together with those school staff to discuss maybe what you found both at school and at home. And then, as I've sort of alluded to there, when you've got lots of examples, you can look through and try to notice patterns. So it might be, is the behaviour happening at a particular time of day, such as maybe in the evenings if your young person's really tired? Is it happening close to meal times when they might be getting hungry? Is the behaviour happening in similar situations? So, for example, in busy, loud environments. So getting a key idea there, and a key area which can be really helpful in working out the purpose of the behaviour is the response. So looking at how are people responding. So if you're looking at school, thinking about teachers, thinking about support staff at home, thinking about how maybe you're responding to the behaviour. And is it, then what we can start to see actually is it's bringing people closer in? Is it that actually it means people leave them alone when that behaviour happens? Does it end an activity which perhaps is difficult for the child? And these are just some sort of examples throwing out of something that you might notice. It's going to be really specific to your young person. But I think on the next slide, hopefully we should have an example of this, which will hopefully make that a bit more concrete. So I'm just going to give you a minute just to have a look over that example of a filled-in star chart before I sort of talk through what we can learn from that. Not sure on everybody's sort of reading speeds, and I'm mindful of time, so I'll give you a minute. And of course, you can always come back to this. But what we can see with this child is that the behaviour that people were concerned about and that was causing distress was him lying down on the floor and not wanting to move, occasionally hitting the adults that were trying to help him to move. And what was found was that actually from tracking all the examples of when this was happening across 2 weeks, we can see that actually the behaviour was only happening at times of transition. So whether that was transition at the end of the school day, whether it was transition getting ready for school, or at the end of the lesson. So what we can understand from that is that this young person finds transitions quite difficult, perhaps especially when there is a change in a routine transition, so such as when he's getting ready for school or in a noisy, busy situation such as a classroom. And what's also really helpful is that by tracking this, what you can notice is that actually the only times he hit someone whilst lying on the floor was when that person tried to physically pick him up, which is really useful to know. And some other things we can notice from the pattern of behaviour and response is that the two most recent episodes of the behaviour, when he lay on the floor for the shortest amount of time and didn't hurt anyone, was actually when a trusted adult just stayed with him, didn't try to move him, stayed calm. And we can also see that when he was given a timer to count down at the end of his art lesson and the classroom was kept a bit quieter, he lay on the floor for a shorter amount of time. So I guess what this is showing really is that actually from tracking this behaviour from both parents and school, learned that having a timer counting down to a transition, a quieter environment during a transition was helpful, and that actually when he does find a transition difficult and he lays on the floor, what works best is just someone being with him and staying calm and providing reassurance. So a shared plan in managing those transitions could be put in place for at home and school. So hopefully that kind of illustrates actually how helpful it can be to track those really specific details to then support the young person with those behaviours of distress. So we thought it was important just to pop a note on here on comorbidity, so other conditions or things that your young person might have going on, and communication. Because we know we've spent a lot of time today talking about communication and what a behaviour is communicating, but actually we know that some of your young people may have other conditions that may impact on how these strategies can be applied or how they're able to communicate. You know your young person best, and it may be that you're able to think of ways to adapt these strategies to suit them. And sadly today, that's just not something that we have the time or the ability to go through with you all individually. But what we can do, and we have the capacity for today, is just to suggest some ways to aid communication if your young person has any other difficulties with communication that might impact how well you're able to have these sort of conversations and use these strategies. So again, these are going to be really specific to your young person if that is relevant for you. We've included some ideas that are commonly used with individuals who may struggle to communicate through speech alone, and we've included ones that families report as helpful and that are evidence-based. But again, it's very individual, so it might be that actually none of these feel helpful, and it might be going away and having a little think about your young person specifically. But we've just included here some ideas. So kind of almost linking back to that idea of transitions are quite difficult. Visual timetables can be really helpful if verbal communication of that isn't always the most helpful for your young person. So that can be as simple as choosing some pictures that your young person can really clearly tell a certain thing. So whether it's school, dinner, travel, whatever it is, and creating a visual timetable for them to look at rather than sort of just telling them what the routine is. And that's quite nice because they can go back and look at that as well. If your young person specifically struggles with verbal communication, there are communication booklets that can be really helpful, and we'd really encourage you to sort of look into those if that is something that you feel would be helpful for your young person. Again, a bit like the visual timetable, but this is for more just for general choice. You can use choice boards if your young person struggles to make those decisions and verbally to communicate what they would like. So again, choosing pictures that relate to things in your young person's life that they might have to make choices about. And finally, one that feels a bit more commonly used, at least with the young people that I've worked with, having some kind of iPad or tablet communication device can be really helpful. And there are lots of apps that actually have, there are apps set up to aid with communication for people that might find that verbally difficult. Yeah, and that's obviously going to be really specific to your young person and access to resources. But as I mentioned, these are just ones that have been reported as helpful, and it felt really important to just make a note to this that might not be relevant for everyone, but it felt like we needed to make a note on this based on the fact that we are talking a lot about communication, and we know that it might not actually be the easiest thing for your young person. So I mentioned at the start on what we were going to cover that we were going to be thinking about linking purpose with strategy. So I guess what we mean by that is that actually once you understand the purpose of the behaviour, you can more effectively plan a strategy for how to support with that behaviour. So we really want whatever we're trying to do to support a behaviour of distress to be matched up to the purpose. So kind of leading on from the slide we've just spoken about, actually, if it's that your young person is having that behaviour of stress to communicate an unmet need, then we would say kind of like logically your approach is going to be to try and meet the need if possible. Ideally, if you can meet the need quickly, either as soon as the concerning behaviour happens, or even better, when you notice warning signs that the behaviour might be imminent. So meeting the child's needs might be quick. It might be something that actually what you've noticed is that behaviour of distress is that they're communicating that they're in pain, and it might involve providing appropriate pain relief. It could be that it's a sign that they're hungry and you provide food. So there are some of those things that might be quick fixes. Or it might be a longer term task of planning together with your young person or with their school how you can address some of those unmet needs. If we were thinking maybe more so if a behaviour of distress is communicating overwhelming emotions, then it might be that actually we think about how do we help our child to manage big emotions as they're coming up. And we did run a previous workshop in this in the Neurodiversity series. So that should be on YouTube if you wanted to go and have a look at that. We'd really recommend watching that because we talk about supporting our young people with overwhelming emotions in much more detail. And that includes lots of strategies such as calming and grounding techniques, which you guys have already mentioned as being helpful in the previous Slido. But it also has some guidance on sort of self-help or professional help for emotion difficulties. If we're maybe thinking that that behaviour of distress is communicating a need for attention, we'd probably really advise going with that connection before correction. So we're going to, so we've already covered that. So that idea, actually, if your child is trying to communicate with their behaviour that they want or feel they need attention and love for you, then it might be helpful to schedule in time where they do get your sort of one-to-one attention, reassurance, praise, all those lovely feelings that we can give them. So this might be perhaps scheduling time to do a shared activity that they enjoy or value. And just to note there, we do know that in busy households that can be really difficult finding this time, and even if you aren't able to provide that one-to-one time immediately in the moment, actually if you can kind of explain to them that there will be some one-to-one time with you soon and make a plan of exactly when that can be, then that can be enough in that moment to help them sort of feel contained and help to support with that behaviour of distress, even if it's not providing it right within that moment. Also felt important to think about if actually that behaviour of distress is in relation to sensory distress. Addressing sensory distress, of course, can involve things like removing whatever is making your child feel distressed. For example, if they are too hot, it might be helping them take off a layer of clothes or running some cold water over their hands or their wrists. Or it might be that there's a particular sound or smell in the house which you are able to get rid of. Obviously, what we know is that in some circumstances, of course, it's not always going to be possible to remove the distressing thing, such as the sound of other children at school. So having other ways to help them calm, sensory calming ways can be really helpful. So it might be making them a little sensory soothing kit with items such as ear, sort of the little... You can have ear defenders, or you can have the little ear things that you put in your ears, which my mind has gone blank, but I hope you all know what I'm talking about.
The loop earplugs?
loop earplugs, there you go, thanks Lucy. Or it might be there's other ways to sort of help with that sensory soothing. So it might be they have a particular item that feels really nice and brings them calm. We do have a whole workshop on sensory needs, which goes into sensory differences in more detail. So that is there if that is helpful for you, if this is a reason that maybe your child is showing behaviours of distress. And finally, we just touched on reducing triggers. So I guess once you understand what is triggering a certain concerning behaviour, there might be things that you and maybe the school can do to reduce triggers in the first place, or at least reduce how distressing the triggers might be. So if you understand that big transitions are particularly triggering for your child, then you can work with the school on a comprehensive transition plan between school years. You could create a countdown and maybe a story of pictures to explain transitions like moving classrooms, or if it's a big school year move, what the next school year might look like. So just thinking about if there's anything that can be done to reduce triggers sort of preemptively once we understand that behaviour. So our next slide talks about what I mentioned earlier, which is this idea of recognition, autonomy, and natural enforcement. So I guess this is going to this idea that actually, how can we support the behaviours that we want to see more of? And also thinking about what are the natural consequences of behaviours that might pose a danger to themselves or other people. And I think the main focus is here is that we really want to recognise when our children do something positive. We want to support them to be doing that. We want to be sort of supporting our young people to do things independently as much as possible. Some of those mentions earlier in the slido about worries for the future. We want to get to a place where we feel comfortable supporting them to be independent and be able to do these things. And whilst, as it was interestingly mentioned in the video that we watched earlier, where we sort of, he mentioned that, you know, the traditional way is that you have rewards and you have consequences and you have discipline. Whilst we're not supporting it in a really traditional sense, what we are referencing is that actually we do recognise that rewarding positive behaviour does have a good effect on sort of seeing more of the behaviours that are really positive for our young people. So what do we mean by rewarding behaviours? So we know that actually recognising and rewarding positive behaviours increases the likelihood that behaviours will be repeated. So it is just part of our human nature that is something that we know. But what we're trying to be really clear on is this isn't about there being things like conditional love, that you only get that when, you know, you've done something positive. But actually what it is about is recognising when our children do things well, and motivating them towards doing things in that way again. So we've outlined a few different types of reward that might help to reinforce those positive behaviours that we want to be seeing. But really at the heart of it, it's all about helping our young people to feel recognised for positive things and increasing their opportunities for success. These are going to be very personal to what you feel is appropriate. We're not talking about big, expensive rewards, but we know, as I've already said, that as human beings, we are motivated by reward and by feeling success. So it's really helpful to give some of these opportunities. So it might be that feeling of reward and feel of success is through that sense of pleasure. So what do they enjoy doing? Is it that they might have a special interest? You know, what is it that they're really passionate about? How can we support them in this? It might be that they really enjoy sports and really encourage them, helping them to engage in those, and then getting that sense of reward after doing that activity. And yeah, really tying it in with a sense of achievement as well. What makes them feel good about themselves? Where can they get a sense of mastery? Where they feel they can accomplish something? So sort of thinking about what can we link them in with that helps them feel skilled. And also just linking it in with what they value. So what is important to them? So that might be a sense of belonging. It might be connection. So what can we do to help them feel more connected to others or feel like they belong somewhere? Is it joining a special interest group or finding a group of peers where they feel accepted for who they are? And also this idea of goals as well. Is there something that they can work towards? Is there, a particular skill they'd like to learn, and that could be a goal that they're working towards? And we might have to be really curious with our young people to try and connect with them about what might be rewarding for them. But I guess what we're thinking here is just increasing their opportunity to have that rewarding feeling, and increasing those opportunities when we know that these other behaviours of distress might be going on around them. But moving on to think about natural consequences. So we know that actually we try and move away from this idea of consequences that feel punitive or scary. But what we do know is that in certain circumstances, a negative response does make a behaviour less likely to be repeated. So instead of being really sort of descriptive about suggestions of what that might be to you, I guess what we've done here today instead is we've given some guidance of actually being really clear, consistent, and having proportionate boundaries rules that are useful. So making it really clear that there will be natural consequences that happen as a result of certain behaviours. And I guess this might be linking in some of those behaviours that were spoken about on Slidos, where maybe it puts themselves at harm's way or other people at harm's way. And it might be helpful that actually you have some time thinking about these together when emotions aren't high, to think about actually what are the natural consequences that might happen. For example, if I make a mess, the natural consequence will be I'll have to tidy that up, and that might naturally mean that it's less fun for me because I'm having to tidy it up, because it's eating into my time. But that is a natural consequence of that behaviour. But also really important to hold in mind is after these things is having that repair, having that ability to restore that connection, and planning together with your young person what happens if this behaviour happens again. So I guess what we're thinking about here is that actually we want our young people to understand that whilst there might be a natural consequence, we want them to know that actually this doesn't impact on your love for them or your care for them, and we want to be able to sort of help them feel that connection again after there are natural consequences of behaviours. So moving on to think about working with schools, it feels really important to acknowledge that actually, one, we might have some parents here whose young people aren't in school currently, but it does feel important to acknowledge that actually the value of working with schools if your young person is in education. So as we've kind of said, that actually when we're supporting young people with behaviours of distress, working together with school staff to support your child at school can be really important, so that all the adults in their lives have a shared understanding of what approach to supporting them is in place, and having a really clear plan through home and through school. But also just really important to sort of pop a reminder here that we have mentioned in previous workshops that actually children are entitled to needs-based support at school regardless of diagnosis. So we spoke about at the start, we asked, at what phase in your journey you are with that. That feels really important to mention, because that means that actually if your child doesn't have a diagnosis yet, or they're on a waiting list, they are still entitled to support for their specific needs, which can include helping them reduce triggering situations and managing emotions and behaviours of distress at school. So across England, special educational needs and disabilities information, advice and support, so that's SENDIA services, they provide free advice on matters relating to SEND. So the service can support you with accessing appropriate needs-based support for your child in their school. And the local Suffolk SENDIAS has loads of online recorded and live workshops on SEND topics, which you might find helpful. And I guess also just important to remember that schools can access consultation and support from other services, such as special education services or mental health services for children in their school, regardless if they have a diagnosis. So if you think that might be something that's helpful, you can ask school to access consultation for more specific professional advice on how to support your child with specific needs. And I believe we've got an example of this on the next slide. So it might be that actually it would be helpful for them to receive consultation on how to support with sensory sensitivities to sound, offering an adjustment and tracking whether that's working and making a plan of when that will be reviewed. But I guess as well, holding in mind when we're talking about support from school and linking up with school, those charts, the behaviour charts we spoke about earlier, that would be really helpful to sort of have school on board with that as well. And a final message really, which we couldn't really go through this whole workshop without referencing the importance of your own well-being. I always think that when we mention this, it can feel a bit like the last thing on the to-do list. You're all here today, obviously for different reasons, all surrounding the same sort of topic. And we know that looking after yourself can be really tough when you've got all these different things going on. And some parents on the call may be neurodivergent themselves with additional pressures of supporting neurodivergent children. But I guess what we would say here is that actually you are the regulator of the regulator. So to give you the best chance you can to help your young person to be able to regulate, to be able to manage those behaviours of distress, you need to almost fill up your own resource cup first. We always talk about this idea that you can't pour from an empty cup. And it kind of goes back to that the thing, they say to you on an airplane to put on your oxygen mask before you put on your child's. And it comes back to that idea that actually it's really important to remind yourself that you do matter and you need to give yourself permission to look after yourself. So even if it's seeing if you can fit 5 minutes somewhere in your day to do something that fills up your own cup, that helps you to feel calm, regulated and supported, is a really great place to start. So it could be really as simple as reaching out to a friend, sending a text to a friend, having a 2-minute text conversation. It could be, sitting in a room with a lit candle, listening to some music that you like for 5-10 minutes. But just really stressing the idea here that it is so important to do things for yourself, as hard as it can be when there is so much going on. With that in mind, just as we're coming to the end of the workshop, just thinking about how do you fill your own resource bucket, because I think it can be really helpful to share ways that you might find helpful to have a bit of you time, and it might be that somebody else on this call looks at that and thinks, I'd quite enjoy trying that, and that might go on their list as well. Lovely, yeah, really, really nice. Can be a really mindful activity. Swimming once a week, brilliant, yeah. Podcasts, music, gardening and listening to music. A walk and talk with a friend, yeah, lovely. So you're getting that real connection and that all those positive endorphins we get from exercise as well. Meditation, shopping, writing, guitar lessons, brilliant. There's some really, really lovely examples here. You can see music's coming up quite a lot. Perfect. So hopefully there'll be some bits on there that you might take inspiration from, or might just be a reminder of some of the things that you can do to fill up your own resource bucket. So we have just got some links to resources and support. So all of these links will be in your resource packs that are sent after the workshop. But just reference to some of the things on here. So Yvonne Newbold is a parent who talks about her own experiences in this area in her TED talk, but she also has a website with lots of helpful free resources. So that's linked there. There is the Challenging Behaviour Foundation, which is listed within here, which includes lots of resources that might be helpful. We've also got a Behaviour Safe at Home support parents that supports parents, carers and family members living with children who might display behaviours of distress. And then we've also got some Suffolk family support specific resources here that can all be accessed via the info link that's there. So that will all be in your pack. And then here, just a bit more about local offers. So they are all on there. So information, advice for families from special educational needs and disabilities in Suffolk, so SEND. And we've just linked some there for you to have a look through. Are there any of those you think are particularly important to just talk through now, Lucy?
No, I think it's just a case of kind of knowing what's out there and being able to kind of look through them and find if there's any that might be best fit for you and your family. But yeah, these are all links, so hopefully when you get sent the slides you can just click on them and it'll take you straight to the website and you'll be able to kind of see if there's anything that's the best fit for you.
Brilliant. And again, I think in our next slides we just have some links to the psychology in schools workshops, so like today, the other ones that are available. So those available to book on, but also some already exist recorded on YouTube.
So I guess just to say with the psychology in schools, we have the childhood neurodiversity parent workshop programme, which today is part of, but then we also have a separate kind of mental health parent workshop programme as well. So there's lots of different kind of mental health topics covered within that. So if there's kind of specific areas of need around mental health coming up, they might be helpful.
I think we've just referenced Recovery College here as well. So if you haven't heard of Recovery College, they have quite a lot of helpful resources. And I think Recovery College offer support in relation to for people who are, am I right in saying, awaiting diagnosis, Lucy? I believe they have some support in place. They're not sort of intensive, but groups they offer. So that is available if you go and look on their on the link here as well, but also they offer different resources available through that link.